Hi. Well, no, your color hasn't gone away from your screen. This is the critique and review of the Grayscale assignment for you. So I thought it was best that the title card be in Grayscale. I'm going to try to get through all of the pieces in one session. We only have 12 of them turned in, so we're going to do them in one long session, and it may be a little while, but remember, you can always pause and restart these if you choose to. But I think it'll go fairly quickly based on how the first section stuff went. So let's get started. Here we have a really nice, serene, pensive portrait in black and white. The conversion is beautifully done. You've got great detail in the skin, in all of the tones. This is a very, very nice portrait. What I'm about to say is stylistic, not technical. Were it mine, I would say that the real shot is right here in his face and his expression. So I would probably come in on it a bit and try to emphasize that. Maybe it was something more like this. And then to emphasize the face even more, because you've got a lot of gray in here. So I'll make a big, soft area. And I just want to add a little bit of tone so that it adds a little variance to that background, and it's not quite as static as it might otherwise be. That, I think, is going to push his face out a little more toward us and really make it more noticeable. But that's style. That would be the way I would do it. I'm not going to suggest that's the way that you need to do this. It's really very nice the way it stands. So let's get on to the next one. Well, this is an interesting architectural grouping of buildings. The only issue that I would have with it is exposure. Your exposure is really pretty hot, and consequently, you've got a lot of areas down in here, up in here, that are simply blown out. You need more detail in there. So the solution is simple. Cut the exposure back. Remember, you can always build contrast in the raw converter or in Photoshop. But if it is too contrasty and you've managed to blow out the highlights, or like over here, block up these shadows, those are sometimes very hard to pull back. You're better off starting out with a flatter file and then creating the contrast you want for the final. The basic conversion is done really well. It's a nice view of this. I would straighten these buildings up. Remember how we did that? Select all, transform, skew, pull that over to where it's straight, and this will look a little better. Well, this is an interesting floral arrangement. It's not exactly a conversion to grayscale, since we have some saturation still left in it. It looks more like it's mostly but not completely desaturated. We still have the red rose, the green leaves, the little yellow centers to these flowers. If you're going to want something to look like a hand-colored image, then good hand coloring is going to have a little more saturated color to it than this. And start from a slightly warm-toned image. It'll look more like the traditional ones. This one is, because of all of that gray and all of that muddy gray, looks really flat. In this one, you could selectively build up some contrast for it. It would look a lot better. Well, this is another interesting floral tableau with the playing cards and the cat. Interesting. The flowers. The only issue here, again, is one of blown out highlights. That's something you really must watch for. Remember, in digital, you blow the highlights and they're gone. I'm going to pull down the levels function because it's got the histogram. And I want you to pay really close attention to this. This overall file has too much contrast. The blacks are off of this edge. the whites and highlights are off of this edge, and they're really off of this edge with a lot of this highlight being blown out. You needed to flatten this. You either needed to cut the light on this background or increase the fill into the shadows, or take your camera, go into the menus, and turn the contrast down. Remember, in one of our first lessons, I talked about that's an option you have. You can adjust contrast shot to shot in your digital camera. And when you see a histogram like this, especially if you see it in your camera, and you ought to be looking for it, then make the adjustments you need to get the shot as you want it. In here, the conversion seemed to have worked, but it's just much too contrasty to pull this together. Parts of this scene that may be really important are lost by being blown out. Well, this is a fascinating portrait in the mirror, showing as a clever way to show the subject and the background where she might be. I would probably come in and darken this background a little bit so that we really were concentrating on what's going on in this mirror. The rest of this is providing context and is potentially important, but don't let it become distracting. Here we need to show either a little more of her or a little less. You've shown something here, but we assume this is the same person in the mirror because of the proximity. But don't make a viewer guess at anything in that sense. So a little more, a little less. The grayscale conversion, though, is very nice. You did a very good job of this. It seems to have a very subtle tone to it, and that works for this. So in that sense, this is a good job. Well, here again, we have a highlight blowout situation. You've got all of this pattern. Probably very interesting. This maybe really should be a color shot, not a grayscale shot. But you've got all of this pattern. It's all blending together, and important areas of the detail are being lost because the exposure is too hot. I'm going to see if maybe we can bring this back with the duplicate layer. If we duplicate this layer, we set this to multiply. Oh yeah, we've got stuff all over here. You're just off by a stump. If we take about half of that, now we can see this kind of detail much better. Now that we can see it, now you can determine where is the photograph in here. This part isn't helping us. That's distracting. This is just identical to this. That isn't helping. So our real photograph is in here. And we could hone in on that and make this a much stronger shot. When you've got all of this much repetitive patterning, when you're shooting in the viewfinder, look for something in the pattern that is different, where the directional lines change or the type of pattern changes or something changes that's going to draw your attention, and that's going to be your focal point. Otherwise, the pattern just gets boring and busy and you're lost in it. Here we have a nice overview of the mountains and a really good capture of the sun raking across these reeds that are here in the foreground. Nice capture. We really don't need all of this sky since it's blank. If there were clouds or poofy things in here that made it interesting, then fine, but right now it's just gray. So you could crop this down a little bit, or maybe vignette it down, might work even better. This foreground capture, though, is really nice. I think this works very well. The little pool of light here, the light on here, that worked well. The grayscale conversion worked well. You've just got to do something about all of this. And by dividing this shot in half, you've basically told us that these two areas have equal importance in your story. Well, if that's the case, there needs to be something up here that's important rather than just gray. So really start thinking about all of these areas. We'll harp on this the entire semester to beat it into everyone, but you look at what's important in the shot. In this case, it's here. This is really well done and is beautiful. Don't put other stuff in your shot that's going to detract from it, because your eye is going to want to be jumping up into here, not really getting down into the weeds, so to speak, and playing in this area. This is an interesting, enigmatic shot. The individual emerging from the tunnel, or is he coming into the tunnel? With the silhouette, you can't really tell, and that adds interest and dynamics to the shot. So this is pretty well done. In this case, I would leave most of it here. I know, surprise, surprise, I don't want to crop it. But because of this, it shows that this is a large space. This tunnel that he's in isn't just a framework, it's a dark place. And he is either coming or going from it, coming from or going to this light out here. It's good that you put this out of focus. Were it sharp, it would start to compete with all of this. So this is really an excellent job. Nice, enigmatic, surreal, almost metaphorical portrait. So this is a very good job. Well, it did convert to grayscale. It is pretty flat. There's no real black in it. When you're working in black and white, and this is actually true in color as well, but if you recall from Photo 100, if you took it, an image needs some black. It needs some highlight. If it's all gray, which this one pretty much is, then it just comes across as muddy, like the exposure isn't good. Now we can correct that a little bit in Photoshop, and we can probably do it simply by first going into levels. Oh yeah, look at this. There's no shadow, no highlight. Let's see what we can do to help this. Let's brighten that up. Bring the shadows in. Now, that seems to solve our problem. And if this stays as a small file, it might. But I'll save that. I'm going to open those curves back up, or that histogram rather, and look at what's happened. All of these tones have been broken up, and everywhere there's not a solid white line, there is no tone. So if this got enlarged, you would see a lot of banding across these even tones, and it'd be really ugly. So the solution isn't to correct it in Photoshop. The solution is to do it right in the camera. Well, and here we have another conversion to grayscale that again is just flat. There's very little tone in here. Again, if we go into levels, what have we got? Our white starts here, which is in this gray. Our black starts here, which is in this just darker gray. So if we want to create some dynamic range, we're going to have to do it after the fact. And again, just like the last one, that's going to result in a shot that bands, has a lot of banding and tone separation when you try to enlarge it. The big issue, though, is where is the shot? What is the shot? By volume, it's mostly this background, which we can't see anything of. None of this is actually really sharp, so I have to assume that our shot is in here, but I don't know that, and there's nothing in here to force me to think that. So you really need to think about your compositions and what it is you're trying to get me to look at and what you're wanting to say about them. It's not just the thing itself, it's the way you present it. A photograph is a new reality. It's not a copy of the original. This may be something that has wonderful meaning to you in the original. To the viewer, none of that baggage gets carried over. All they have is the photograph. So your job is to give them a photograph that helps tell your story, your reaction to it. Well, we do have a really good exposure. Our general range of tones is good, contrast is good. Our only issue is, what is the shot about? We've got all of this pattern against a mercifully out of focus sky. Here it's getting muddy against this out of focus background. So if we really have a pattern that we're going to concentrate on, it is most likely in here somewhere. And that's probably where our shot is. Can we make that work? Well, I don't know. Let's see. Maybe. Maybe. Maybe in here we can make something that has some major visual cohesiveness to it. But without that, when we're taking the entire piece, then there's just too much going on that is going in every direction in all various ways, and there's no place here for our eyes to rest that tells us what it is we're really looking at. So it's an interesting pattern, but there's too much non-pattern that's in this shot to take us away from it. And our final shot. This is the cemetery, obviously, and here our issue comes back to one we started with, a blown out highlight set right in here. This is so critical for you. Digital is so vulnerable to highlight going off the edge that you really have to be careful with it. If this is happening constantly to you, where your shots are always a little overexposed, then you are going to have to make a correction by taking the exposure correction value and dropping it. In this case, probably 2/3 of a stop, maybe a stop, or quit using any kind of auto exposure or anything where it's program mode where you're using, let's say, aperture and you're letting the camera set the other part. All of those are doing their part based on their belief as to what makes a good exposure. And if the meter is off, remember we did this exercise at the very first and there was a reason for it. If the meter is off, then the shot's going to be off, but you get to fix it. That's what's really cool. All you have to do is adjust the exposure compensation to make sure you're no longer blowing your highlights out, and then leave it there for the rest of your shots. Okay, we're at the end of this section. That went pretty quickly. So we'll sign off of this, and I'll see you for the next assignment. Take care.